Thank you very much, Sarah. And I'd like to add my words of welcome to all of you. So wonderful to see you on this chilly December evening. My role this evening is simply to chair the proceedings and to, given that we are online as well as here in person, just to run through a couple of technical details about how we're going to run tonight's session. So shortly I'm going to invite Paul to come and speak to us until about 7 o'clock. And then we'll have about 10 minutes Q&A. And we're very much hoping we'll have mics going around the hall, and we're hoping anybody wanting to join in online, you're very welcome to use the question function. And you'll see there's a box at the bottom of the screen where you can type your question in, and my wonderful colleague here, Olivia Butler, without whom none of this would be happening, will be reading out any of those questions. It may be that we'll be a little limited on time at the end of the evening. We might not have time to answer all the questions that get raised, but we will certainly be passing them on to the speaker. So thank you once again to Paul. I'd now like to invite Ambassador Paul Madden to the stage to give his talk on the Diplomat's Guide to the Geography of Japan. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Simon and Sarah, and thank you all for coming out on a cold evening. I had a lot of interesting experiences during my time as ambassador in Japan, but none of them was quite as interesting as one that one of my predecessors had in, I think it was in the 1970s. And he was on a regional tour of Japan, and he arrived at the railway station of a provincial town, and the entire town council and the mayor had all turned out to meet him. We had a big banner across the platform at the station, and it said, "A heartfelt welcome to the ambassador of France." Now, he was a very nice man and he didn't want to upset anyone, so he decided that for the rest of the day, he would just pretend to be the French ambassador. And so he went around talking in a sort of ham French accent, and just occasionally he couldn't resist throwing into the conversation phrases like, you know, even though I am the French ambassador, I must tell you, my favorite country is actually the Grand Bretagne. And since it's almost Christmas, I thought I'd also share with you a true story of a Christmas event that I was invited to in Japan about 3 years ago. And it was the annual Christmas dinner of the Christians in the Japanese parliament, who are a relatively small group. And so they invited a number of foreign ambassadors to pad out the numbers and take part. And we all had to make a little speech. So I said a few words in Japanese. One of the other ambassadors got up to speak, and they were speaking in English, but with a slight accent. And so when they pronounced the word miracles, talking about the Christmas story, the interpreter heard it as Americans because she pronounced it miracles. And so it came over as Americans. And so we had this wonderful thing where, as the speech proceeded, they were interpreted as having said, well, you know, Jesus Christ came on this earth to create Americans. And when things get too bad, we just have to go down on our knees and pray for an American. So today I'm going to be talking about the geography of Japan, the country where I've spent 8 years of my life and where I was until last year the British ambassador. So why geography? Well, the first reason is because it was my original academic discipline. In fact, just down the road from here at your neighboring university in Cambridge. In fact, we used to come up here to the North Norfolk coast on geography field trips. And the second reason is that I think that many aspects of a country, from its internal situation to its external relations, are influenced by its underlying geography. So I came to diplomatic life in Japan with the eyes of a geographer. And many of the experiences that I had and the understandings that I gained reinforced my belief in the importance of a geographical perspective. Now, I'm not saying that this is the only approach. If I'd done history or PPE, I might be starting this lecture in a very different way, let alone if I'd done quantum mechanics. But what do I mean when I talk about geography? Those of you who can think back to your own experiences of geography, perhaps at school, can no doubt remember that the subject seemed to be split into two distinct fields, physical and human. In physical, we went out and measured things like river flows, and in human, we interviewed shoppers and asked them how far they'd come, because geography teachers always seemed keen to get us out of the classroom. We never did manage to find an oxbow lake, though. But in fact, the two subjects are not as separate as they may seem. Humans and physical geography interact with each other. And nowadays, the subject is often defined as being about place and process, locating observable phenomena and trying to work out how and why they came about. So what would be the first thing that a geographer diplomat might ask when setting off on their first visit to Japan, which in my case was in 1983 on a study tour organized by the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which actually changed my life. It began a lifelong fascination with Japan, which resulted in me joining the Foreign Office, being sent back to university, going to learn Japanese at SOAS. I was posted to Tokyo in the late 80s and the early 90s, and entering a long diplomatic career, much of which was centered on the Asia-Pacific region. Well, the first thing I did was got out a map and look at where Japan is. This map shows us that Japan is a group of islands, an archipelago, off the shore of a large continent. It's a bit further from the Asian landmass than Britain is from Europe, about 200 kilometers at its narrowest point, compared to just 33 kilometers for the UK. But like Britain, it was once joined to the continent, in fact, not much more than 10,000 years ago. And Simon Kainer, director of CISJAC, who's a distinguished archaeologist, knows far more about this aspect than me, so I'll move hastily on. But just as with the continental influences on Britain's history and development, Asia, and particularly China, have had a very significant impact on Japan. Nevertheless, there are also significant consequences of being an island, leading to an independence and sometimes a different way of thinking and new ways of evolving from continental influences. So where does Japan lie in terms of latitude? That is to say, where does it sit between the equator and the North Pole? If you look at images from the northern island of Hokkaido, deep snow, ports hemmed in by ice floes in winter, you would be forgiven for thinking that it's very far north indeed. In fact, in Abashiri, a port town in Hokkaido, we visited a museum of northern peoples, which draws parallels between the lives of the indigenous local Ainu people and the Eskimos and the Inuit. But in fact, as this map shows, there is no point in Japan that is as far north as the southernmost point of Britain. Tokyo is effectively Mediterranean, for example, on a level with Tunisia or New Mexico. So why then do we think about Japan being cold and snowy? Well, partly because it's mountainous, and I'll come on to that later, but also because of the prevailing influences in winter of winds from Siberia and cold ocean currents flowing down from the polar region. Because of its location, Japan is also subject to a much more extreme range of weather events than the benign situation we tend to enjoy in the UK. Extreme typhoons regularly cause massive storm damage and flooding. And more generally, Japanese winters are cooler, colder, and summers warmer than we're used to. Japan's underlying geology, its position on what seismologists call the Pacific Ring of Fire, means that it regularly experiences earthquakes, tsunamis, and volcanoes, sometimes with devastating consequences. And I think that the constant presence of the threat of natural disasters has affected Japanese character and behaviors. A relief map of Japan will show that Japan is a very mountainous country, about 70% mountains, in fact, with many of the mountains covered by dense forests. In fact, people occupy only about 15% of the total landmass. And until relatively modern times, many towns and villages were very remote and cut off at certain times of year. Turning to more human geography, the earlier map showed who Japan's neighbors are. Some people might call them the neighbors from hell. At the very least, they're a tricky bunch. North Korea, Russia, China. Even South Korea has not been the smoothest relationship with Japan for historical reasons. And this is a crucial field for diplomats as countries form temporary or more permanent alliances to sustain them in their external relationships. And I'll talk in more detail later about the Anglo-Japanese alliance of 1902, the geography of the Pacific War, and current alliances with the US and its allies in the face of the challenge of a rising China. Another thing that geographers like to look at is migration. In the early 19th century, Japan was a source country, sending diaspora in search of better opportunities, mainly in the Americas. And more recently, the number of immigrants coming into Japan has been growing, but it's still very small by comparison with other rich countries. And it's nowhere near enough to deal with Japan's massive demographic problem of a rapidly shrinking and aging population. So that gives you a feel for the kind of things I'm going to be talking about in my diplomatic view of Japan's geography. So let's start with the continental influences. For much of the last 2,000 years, as you know, China was the largest, richest, and most advanced civilization on Earth. So it's not surprising then that many of the things we think of as part of Japanese culture were ultimately derived from Chinese origins. Japanese writing, kanji characters, came from China and were bolted on to an existing spoken language. And that's why today's kanji usually have at least two readings in Japanese, a Chinese one and a Japanese one. And it's a bit like how Anglo-Saxon and Norman words sit side by side in English today. Buddhism, which of course originated in India, arrived in Japan via China and Korea in around the 6th century. So it's not surprising that the Buddhist architecture of temples in centers like Kyoto and Kamakura reflect Chinese buildings. And in fact, for most of history, Japan's Buddhist temples existed peacefully side by side. Often they were literally co-located with shrines from Japan's traditional mode of worship, Shintoism. Indeed, it was only when the 19th century Meiji government tried to promote national identity by turning a disparate system of local folk beliefs into a nationally organized Shinto religion that there was a forced separation from Buddhism, in the course of which as many as 40,000 Buddhist temples may have been destroyed. The Japanese got their chopsticks from China too, but as with many other things, they improved them, not least by creating flat edges, which make it easier to grasp the food with. And of course, it's the foreigners who call them chopsticks. It's actually based on the pidgin Chinese word for hurry. And this was first recorded by the English explorer Dampier, who interestingly also imported the words avocado and barbecue into our language. But I don't want to suggest that Japanese culture is entirely derivative, any more than suggesting that the UK's culture rests exclusively on its Greek and Roman origins. Over the centuries, Japanese culture evolved many unique and unmistakably Japanese manifestations. Geisha in kimonos, sumo wrestlers, and Japanese castles are all distinctively Japanese. And many of the earliest influences from the continent entered Japan via the southernmost island of Kyushu, which is less than 300 kilometers from Korea. Kyushu was also the first landfall of the Europeans in the Great Age of Discovery from about the 16th century. And by the early 1600s, Spanish and Portuguese missionaries were able to establish a significant foothold in Kyushu and Western Honshu, winning many converts. British and Dutch traders followed in their footsteps, including William Adams, the Miura Anjin, the first Briton to live in Japan. But the first Tokugawa shogun, having only recently unified the country following a series of wars during the so-called Sengoku Warring States period, was concerned about this growing foreign presence. So he banished them from the country, launching a 220-year Sakoku period when Japan was largely closed to the world. Largely, but not completely, because Japan still had a small window onto the Western world via a tiny Dutch enclave, which was permitted to remain on an island off Nagasaki. And the great Western clans, like the Satsuma of Kagoshima, far from the eyes of the shogun, continued to do trade around the region. And the Satsuma had actually come to hold sovereignty over the Ryukyu Island Kingdom, which is modern-day Okinawa, from the 17th century. Well, as a geographer would point out, it's relatively easier to cut yourself off from the rest of the world if you're an island than if you are in the middle of a continent. But this self-isolation was costly. It coincided with the Western Enlightenment that led on to the agrarian industrial revolutions. And so by the time that Japan encountered the West again in the mid-19th century, the Europeans and the Americans had become economically and militarily powerful and were able to dictate the terms of Japan's opening up. But Japan began to catch up remarkably quickly. When a modernized, richer, more militaristic Japan began to envy the Western empires in the early 20th century, it looked first to its immediate neighborhood, seizing territory in China and Korea. I think you have to go back quite a long way to find a time when Britain had territorial aspirations in its immediate continental neighborhood, although perhaps the Spanish might debate that about Gibraltar. But generally, Britain's empire in its various stages, North America and the Caribbean, India and the new worlds of Australasia, was a distant maritime empire. For a brief period from 1942, Japan also pursued a maritime empire, seeking access to the natural resources of Southeast Asia. But for the most part, its territorial aspirations lay on its neighboring continent as it colonized Korea, Manchuria, and then fought across eastern China. In its efforts to manage its relations with challenging neighboring continental states, Japan has regularly sought alliances with more distant maritime powers. In 1902, Japan signed an Anglo-Japanese alliance with Britain. The principal aim of the alliance was directed at an increasingly belligerent Russia. With Britain's support, and because that support meant that Germany and France weren't able to join in on Russia's side, Japan was able to fight a brief but successful Russo-Japanese war in 1904-05. And the acclaimed naval victory at Tsushima was a sign that Japan was now a force to be reckoned with. The alliance with Britain was to last until around 1923, by which time Japan's own assertiveness around the region was becoming of concern to the UK and the US. And in 1941, Japan declared war on the US and joined the Second World War on the side of Germany. Well, after the war, concerns about the rise of communism quickly came to predominate. And in Asia, the US increasingly saw Japan as a vital bulwark of Western democracy in the region. They signed a US-Japan security alliance in 1951, under which, to this day, some 50,000 US forces are still serving in Japan. And more recently, with an ever more assertive China massively ramping up its military capabilities and its political rhetoric in line with its growing economic power, Japan has sought new allies in addition to the US. And the late Prime Minister Abe proved particularly adept at building relations with the leaders of regional middle powers like Australia and India, who together with the US and Japan form a group known as the Indo-Pacific Security Quad. Japan has also welcomed growing security cooperation with countries like the UK, encouraging particularly naval collaboration, culminating in the visit by the UK's Queen Elizabeth, the new aircraft carrier, and its accompanying strike group in 2021. Of course, maps can tell differing stories depending on how you present them. This map of the Pacific, drawn up from China's perspective, indicates how China feels it's hemmed in by island chains, including Japan, blocking its access to the Pacific Ocean. Having looked at Japan's situation within its region, let us now turn to look at the Japanese islands themselves. Most countries tend to be located on big continents. Sometimes they occupy a significant island. But archipelagos, groups of larger islands, are relatively rare among major countries. I think Japan and Indonesia would be the two most significant examples. Japan's main three population centers and economic hubs are all located on the largest island of Honshu, in regions where the plains between the mountains allowed large-scale human settlement. The Kanto region around Tokyo, the Kansai region around Osaka, Kyoto, and Kobe, and the Chubu region around the giant industrial city of Nagoya. In fact, more than 80% of Japanese people live on Honshu. That's just over 100 million people. But the other main islands also have not insignificant populations. 13 million people live on Kyushu, 5 million on Hokkaido, and 4 million on Shikoku. So there are sizable and important cities on other islands too, like Fukuoka on Kyushu and Sapporo on Hokkaido. And some of the major cities are quite distant from each other, and Japanese are used to flying between them, as well as using the Shinkansen bullet train. So Kyoto was the official capital of Japan for around 1,000 years, from 794 to 1868. The word Kyoto actually means capital city. It was the home of the emperor and the spiritual center, with many of Japan's most famous Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines. But from 1603, the shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu, who had consolidated the country and become the effective ruler, established his capital in Edo, which was the old name for Tokyo. And in 1868, the forces of the Meiji Emperor, consisting particularly of powerful Western clans like the Satsuma and the Choshu, defeated the shogun in the Boshin War. The emperor relocated himself to Edo, and he renamed it Tokyo, which means Eastern Capital. Tokyo is now one of the largest cities on Earth. Strictly speaking, the city itself has a population of 14 million, but if you look at the wider metropolis, it's nearly 40 million, around a third of the national population. Japanese life, political, economic, cultural, has become very concentrated on Tokyo. Many major companies, even if they were originally founded in Osaka, moved their headquarters to Tokyo. In fact, if Tokyo was a country, it would be a member of the G7. In the 1850s, the Western powers had forced Japan to allow them to settle and to trade in a number of so-called treaty ports. Within those treaty ports, the laws of their own country, rather than the laws of Japan, would be applied. The Japanese government tried to keep these places away from the major population centers, but two of them, Yokohama as the gateway to Tokyo and Kobe as the gateway to Osaka, grew into great port cities. And if you visit them today, you can still find interesting vestiges of the 19th century Western settlements. Particularly in Yokohama, you can find foreign-style houses and churches up on the bluff above the harbor, as well as a really fascinating cemetery for the many foreigners who died there, often at a sadly young age. Nagasaki on Kyushu, with its long history of Western contacts, also became a major treaty port and developed a large-scale shipbuilding industry. Other treaty ports like Shimonoseki, which sits on the straits between Honshu and Kyushu, and Hakodate, right up in Hokkaido, were much less successful. Another big consequence of the Meiji Emperor's restoration was a push to develop the large northern island of Hokkaido, which was at that time largely empty, save for a small population of indigenous Ainu. So there were two drivers for this. The first were concerns to occupy Hokkaido as a bastion against potential Russian aggression. And second, the need to find something to do for all the samurai warriors who had now become redundant in the new Japan. And the island made really quite remarkable and rapid progress under the Hokkaido Development Commission, whose famous Northern Star logo still persists in the label of the Sapporo Beer Company. Well, I now wanted to turn to look at another area of geographical interest, which is transport. As an island archipelago with dense mountainous forests, coastal navigation was very important historically, particularly in the west of the country, where the inland sea, which strictly speaking is not inland, links the islands of Kyushu, Honshu, and Shikoku. And for anyone who's not visited Japan, I think that the inland sea is one of the most beautiful places to visit, so I would strongly recommend it. The two major population centers of the Kansai around Osaka and the Kanto around Tokyo, which literally mean the western and eastern checkpoints, were linked by traditional roads. The most famous was called the Tokaido. Just over 300 miles long, it had 53 post stations, which are featured in a famous series of woodblock prints by Hiroshige. Most ordinary citizens were not even allowed to travel at all at those times. Those merchants and nobles and their retinue who were allowed usually went by foot, with the wealthier and more important travelers carried in sort of sedan chairs. And interestingly, today's Shinkansen bullet train more or less follows the ancient route of the Tokaido. But traveling at speeds of up to 200 miles per hour, it does a journey which used to take weeks in just 3 hours. Another ancient walking route, the Nakasendo, connected the same destinations, but was further inland and much more mountainous. Parts of the original road and some pretty post stations remain, like Magome, shown here. Hiking trips along stretches of the old road are now increasingly popular with overseas tourists. While we're looking at maps of Japan, I wanted to briefly mention the disposition of the US military forces in Japan, because, as I said, there are still some 50,000 US troops and a similar number of their family members. As you can see from this map, they're located all over Japan. But actually, around 75% of them are located on the island of Okinawa, which, incidentally, was only returned to Japanese control by the US occupation in 1972, 20 years after the rest of Japan. And although Japanese public opinion broadly welcomes the US military presence, there are many voices of opposition in Okinawa itself, where the US military are very visible and at times seen as somewhat challenging. So changing subject a little now, another big focus for geographers is climate. It influences where people can live, the agriculture that they can sustain, and the sometimes extreme conditions that they might have to face. And Japan is a country of very distinct seasons. Winters can be cold and very snowy, particularly on the Japan seaside facing the Asian continent, though the days can still be quite bright and sunny in winter. Spring brings the famous cherry blossoms, and April is actually the turn of the year for schools and for many workplaces, so there are lots of reasons to have hanami parties under the blossoms. If you visit Japan at that time, you'll see the whole country seemingly out on picnics under the cherry blossoms. Summers are very hot and humid, so probably not the best time to visit, but autumn is actually my favorite time. You have the beautiful Momiji autumn leaves, which last rather longer than the cherry blossoms, and they include some really extraordinary red colors from the Japanese maples, as well as golden ginkgo tree leaves. Unlike the West, where we expect our supermarkets to provide pretty well everything all the year round, Japanese tend to focus much more on eating seasonal delicacies at the time when they become available locally. And I think this is particularly noticeable in fruit. You imagine things like persimmon or nashi pears and a great variety of citrus fruits that Japan produces, including mikan oranges, which are actually the things that we call satsumas. And you'll remember I mentioned earlier that the satsumas were the name of the clan who lived on the island of Kyushu. So Japan's food self-sufficiency rate is about 38%, and that compares, for example, to the UK, which is 54%. But only a small portion of Japan's land, less than 20%, is suitable for farming because of the mountains. And so what little land there is tends to be farmed very intensively, usually for crops and mainly for rice. And the majority of farms are very small, using specially designed miniature farm vehicles. And you see tiny paddy fields tucked into every available space, including sometimes even in built-up areas. About 4% of Japan's population Japan's workforce, are involved in agriculture. And that's more than double the percentage for the UK. But for the vast majority of Japan's farmers, this is a part-time occupation, usually alongside other forms of work. Japanese rice production is very highly subsidized and heavily protected against foreign competition. When I was involved in negotiating the UK-Japan Free Trade Agreement, agriculture was by far the most difficult issue. But most Japanese seem quite content to pay more for their rice, partly because they genuinely believe it tastes better, but partly because there is a recognition of the need for greater self-sufficiency, which I think is evoked perhaps by memories of the severe food shortages at the end of the Second World War and in its immediate aftermath. Well, I think you all know that Japan eats a lot of fish, and the healthy diet is one of the reasons why Japan has among the most long-lived healthy lives in the world. But in fact, in 2011, for the first time, Japanese consumed more meat than fish or seafood, and that trend has continued. Japanese now only eat around half the volume of seafood that they consumed just 20 years ago. Nevertheless, it's still an important sector, employing about 200,000 people. Another aspect of the seasons is the matsuri, or the festivals, because every small town or village in Japan seems to have a host of matsuri which take place following the seasonal cycle. Sometimes they are linked to Shinto or Buddhist religious practices, sometimes to agriculture, for example, celebrating the new rice crop. And for a normally rather sober people, Japanese definitely enjoy the chance to get dressed up, drink a bit of sake, and make a lot of noise. In general, the Japanese climate is much less benign than the one that we enjoy in the UK. It is particularly vulnerable to typhoons moving up from the tropics. They're usually worse in August and September, but they can really happen any time between April and November. I remember a particularly bad one, Typhoon Hagibis, which happened in October 2019. And I remember it particularly well as we had Princess Anne staying with us at the time, because she had come as the patron of the Scottish team in the Rugby World Cup. And suddenly everything was cancelled for 24 hours. And so we had to quickly work out an alternative program. Quick, I said to my wife, let's get the Scrabble out. Well, it turned out to be the worst typhoon that had hit Japan for many years. Around 100 people were killed and 250,000 people had to evacuate their homes. And it's not just climate. Japan's geology introduces a number of hazards. If you or your kids did GCSE geography, you're probably familiar with a map like this, showing the so-called Pacific Ring of Fire, where tectonic plates butt up against each other and collide, causing sometimes violent reactions. A British geologist, John Milne, lived in Meiji, Japan for some 20 years and became fascinated by the country's earthquakes and volcanoes. He invented a device called a seismograph to detect and measure tremors, and he became known as the father of modern seismology. Japan's most famous earthquake was the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923, when some 140,000 people were killed in and around Tokyo. The majority actually died as a result of fires, because the earthquake struck at a lunchtime when many people were preparing food and cooking over open fires while living in wooden houses. I'm sure you will remember the more recent Tohoku earthquake in 2011 in the northeast of Japan. It was Japan's most powerful earthquake ever. The epicenter was actually at sea, causing tsunami waves, which in some places reached 40 meters in height, wreaking devastation on many towns along the Pacific coast. Around 20,000 people died. 1 million homes were damaged. More than 10% of them were destroyed completely. And the disaster was compounded by the flooding of generators at the Fukushima nuclear plant, which stopped the cooling system from working, leading to a nuclear meltdown. It was the world's worst nuclear disaster since Chernobyl, leaving much soil and water contaminated. And perhaps worst was the uncertainty, with the system in panic and initially a lack of public communication, which led to huge unrest among the civilian population until the radioactive material was capped and enclosed after just a few days. This event had such a huge impact on Japan that I made a point of making my first official visit as ambassador outside of Tokyo after I arrived there in 2017 to be a trip to Fukushima with protective gear, a Geiger counter, and some trepidation, even though I'd been assured that it was safe. I went into the plant and met some of the workers, talked to them, and they seemed to genuinely appreciate the visit. More generally, I think the Japanese had very much welcomed the assistance which British nuclear experts had provided when the event happened in 2011. And they had also valued the fact that the UK, following the guidance of our government chief scientist and his team, had adopted a more rational and less panicky approach to the crisis than some other countries. Many embassies from other countries evacuated Tokyo immediately, for example. And Japan is also a country of volcanoes. Apparently there are around 111 active ones, and about 15 volcanic events take place every year. I visited the National Monitoring Center for volcanoes and saw banks of TV screens showing footage from each one of them, constantly being monitored. And volcanoes have helped to shape some of Japan's most notable scenery, like the iconic Mount Fuji, which technically is still an active volcano, although it hasn't erupted since, I think, 1708. Also created some of the beautiful volcanic crater lakes, like Lake Mashu in eastern Hokkaido, featured here, which again is a part of Japan I would thoroughly recommend you to visit. And another positive side effect of Japan's seismology is the proliferation of onsens, hot springs, which have produced a very unique Japanese bathing culture with its own elaborate etiquette. There are more than 25,000 hot springs in Japan, and no holiday in the Japanese countryside would be complete without a visit to the bath. My particular favorites are the rotemburo, which are the outdoor baths, where in winter you can sit there as the snow falls and it melts peacefully in the steam just above your head. It's a very sybaritic experience. And personally, I came around to thinking that the persistence of so many natural disasters of climate and geology has inculcated a kind of fatalism within Japanese culture. Traditionally, houses were built to be flimsy and impermanent. And I think that's one of the reasons why Japan was, until very relatively recently, something of a backmarker on the international response to climate change. Of course, there are other reasons too. For example, after the Fukushima disaster, Japan closed all 50 of its nuclear power stations, which had been supplying about 30% of its electricity. And local opposition means that fewer than 10 have actually managed to reopen so far. Japanese industry was also a big exporter of coal-fired generating plants to countries in places like Southeast Asia. So persuading Japan to take a more active role on climate change was a significant task for my embassy in the run-up to the COP26 conference in Glasgow. And I think we were, in a small way, one of the factors which helped Japan move towards a more active approach, although actually the replacement of President Trump, who was a climate denier, by President Biden was, of course, a much more significant factor. Moving to yet another geographical topic, I mentioned earlier that Japan is very mountainous. I wanted to talk in a little more detail about some of the consequences of that. And I had the chance to experience country village life in Japan on a number of occasions because back in the 1980s, I helped to twin my hometown in Devon, which is a place called Otari, with a namesake village in Nagano Prefecture called Otari. Many of these mountain settlements were historically inaccessible, separated from even near neighbors by hostile mountain passes, and often entirely cut off for large parts of the year due to heavy snow in winter. So it was only really in the last century that some of these places became more accessible, thanks to huge investments in infrastructure, bridges, tunnels, riverbank reinforcements, snow screens, and dams. In fact, there was much criticism of the pork barrel politics of the spending policies of the Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP, who draw strong support from the rural areas. There were lots of stories of bridges to nowhere being constructed during the high growth period in the constituencies of senior politicians without being part of a strategic transport plan. And because of the severity of the Japanese winters and the remoteness, this infrastructure is very difficult and very expensive to maintain. Life in some villages is only sustainable through significant subsidies and financial transfers from the urban centers. With Japan's shrinking national population and rural depopulation, which I'll discuss in more detail in a moment, the country is going to face some hard challenges in the coming decades about letting some remote communities gradually disappear. Which brings me on to my final topic of demographics. It's another subject that geographers like to think about. Japan has the 11th highest population in the world at around 124 million people. As I'm sure you know, it's a very homogeneous population. 98% of the people who live in Japan are ethnically Japanese. There are just under 3 million foreign nationals living in Japan. About 30% of them are Chinese, and other large groups are Vietnamese and Korean. So it's often described as a rather exclusive culture. Japan does not permit the holding of dual nationalities, and only a very small number of foreigners become naturalized as Japanese citizens. And the differentiation between nationals and foreign permanent residents became particularly acute during COVID. Japan only allowed its own citizens to return to Japan, but not permanent citizens. And this irritated many long-standing residents, often foreigners with Japanese spouses, as it confirmed their suspicion that they were considered somehow to be second-class citizens. We received at the embassy a lot of complaints from Brits living in Japan who were unable to return to the UK for brief visits to visit their family, as they would not then be allowed to return to Japan. So we actively lobbied the Japanese government on this on a regular basis, along with other countries. In the late 19th and early 20th century, significant numbers of Japanese, primarily poorer agricultural workers, emigrated from Japan in search of economic opportunities. The main destinations were in the Americas. Today, by far the largest community is in Brazil. There are some 2 million Japanese diaspora in Brazil and another about 1.4 million in America, largely in Hawaii and on the West Coast. Other significant communities can be found in China, Canada, and Peru. From the 1990s, Japan experimented with encouraging descendants of this so-called Nikkei diaspora to return to Japan to help address labor shortages. Significant numbers did return. The Brazilian community in Japan is now over 200,000, but it's not been an unalloyed success. The Japanese had assumed that the returnees would be easier to integrate and assimilate because of their Japanese ancestry. But in practice, many did not have the necessary Japanese language skills, which constitutes a serious barrier. And after several generations overseas, they often found it difficult to adjust to Japan's fairly unique culture. Japan's current population is fast shrinking and aging. In 2016, fewer than 1 million children were born in Japan, for the first time since records began in 1899. And this was less than 40% of the number who were born in 1949, which was the peak year of the post-war baby boom. The population is set to fall rapidly from its peak of 120 million in 2008. It's expected to be less than 100 million by 2050. It's currently losing about a million every year. So why is this? Well, mainly because many fewer Japanese are getting married, and I saw this a lot in my younger colleagues at the embassy. Around 20% of 50-year-old men and 10% of 50-year-old women have never been married. And a young woman in her 20s today has a 25% chance of never being married and a 40% chance of never having children. And marriage matters because in Japan, only about 2% of children are born outside of wedlock, compared to around half in the UK. And there seem to be economic and cultural reasons for the fall off in marriage, with increased job insecurity as more and more workers are on so-called temporary contracts. Many young people don't feel that they can afford to marry and start a family. Also, Japan remains a rather male-oriented society, and that's a factor that had changed less than I'd expected in the 25 years between our first and second postings there. The expectations on the role of a wife and a daughter-in-law make it much harder to combine a career with marriage and motherhood. And so given the choice, many women are opting to continue with their careers. This population decline is less visible in the major cities where most foreigners go. Tokyo and Osaka remain crowded and bustling. But it's a different picture in the smaller towns and in the countryside. Japan has been experiencing massive rural depopulation. Well over 90% of the population is now urban. Back in 1950, that was only 53%. And it's largely, of course, the young people who move to the cities to study and work, and they seldom return. There isn't a significant counterflow of retirees or home workers seeking a more rural lifestyle, as you would find in the UK. So they leave behind dying villages with schools and restaurants boarded up and abandoned wooden homes which quickly go to rack and ruin. On my travels in Japan, I've regularly seen images like these in the mountainous areas or on islands in the inland sea. The inhabitants of country villages are mainly elderly. Around a quarter of Japan's 65,000 towns have more than half their population over the age of 65. And these charts show how the age profile of Japan's population is changing over time. By 2055, there are going to be relatively few young people at the base, supporting a large overhang of elderly people, fewer people to work and fewer people to pay the taxes. Already, more than 30% of the population is over 65. Thanks to good diet and healthy lifestyles, Japan has among the highest life expectancy in the world at around 85 years. In fact, there are more than 90,000 people in Japan who are over 100 years old. Of course, the population chart would probably look a bit similar to this in the UK and other European countries if it wasn't for immigration, which we use to bring in younger people with a higher propensity to have children. Japanese society, however, has been reluctant to accept large-scale immigration. So what are the solutions? Well, the first is for elderly people to stay in the workplace longer. After all, they're often relatively fit and healthy. The second is to make even more use of women in the workplace, although actually female labor participation rates are already quite high at around 52%, but for a mix of cultural reasons, they tend to be skewed towards part-time and lower skilled work. A third possibility is to make more use of robots. I accompanied the UK's chief scientific advisor, the chap you may remember from your screens during COVID, to visit an elder care home in Japan where they were experimenting with using robots for lots of purposes to help the elderly, including using robot pets to help dementia sufferers. So Japan certainly has the challenges of an aging population. But if anyone can tackle that, it's Japan. Its experience of COVID demonstrated that it was vastly more successful at keeping its people alive than most advanced nations. And this was despite having a significantly older population living in much denser urban concentrations. And unlike other Asian countries, it achieved that success on COVID without any draconian new government restrictions. The government simply made suggestions about public behaviors that a very compliant population seemed happy to follow. Well, I've given you a canter through many aspects of Japanese geography. I've tried to explain how the underlying geography influences many aspects of Japanese life. I hope I've also given you a sense of the beauty, charm, and fascination of this unique country, which has been a really important part of my life. And if you want to know more, I can recommend a good book. Sankyu Japan is a light-hearted description of 39 of my favorite things about Japan. It was published earlier this year, based on a series of tweets that I made during my time as ambassador. There were 39 because those of you who speak Japanese will know that the numbers 3 and 9 can be pronounced Sankyu. So it was my way of saying thank you to Japan. And thank you for coming along and listening this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that superlatively diplomatic, as you said, canter through Japan. I think encouraging us all to get back there as quickly as possible, either to enjoy the food or the hot springs or the beauty that's there, but also so carefully tempered with those, I think, all sorts of comments on the state of Japan as it is today, and some of the things that make it a challenging place to be, but such an intriguing place to study. So thank you very much indeed. I'm sure we have some questions from our audience. It's all looking a little bit dark out there, but we have a roving pair of microphones, I believe. So if anybody does have any questions for Paul, I have some, but I'm sure you have much more interesting ones than I do. Please put your hand up and we'll get a microphone to you momentarily. There's one just in the middle row up here. I think there's a mic just on its way right now.
Hello, is that working? Yes. The demographic position is quite an interesting one. We tend to think of Japan in the 60s and 70s being very much at the forefront of innovation, technology, engineering, etc. Not heard so much recently about that. And I'm just wondering whether you think Japan has got the sufficient intellectual drive to, I know you mentioned robotics, but you know, what your view is of that.
Thank you. For those of you who couldn't hear the question, it was, where can I get copies of this fantastic new book? So the answer is you can find it on Amazon Kindle, and I've got a few copies with me today. No, but seriously, the question was about whether Japan is still continuing to produce a lot of innovation. I think certainly the situation does seem a bit different from the period during the 70s and the 80s, when Japan seemed to be leading the cutting edge of many industrial and economic developments. And I think some of the reason for that is that at that time, a lot of the developments were in the sphere of manufacturing, at which, as we know, Japan, for many cultural reasons, excels. Whereas more recently, many of the most important innovations have been more in the services space, although often there's an important technological underpinning for those developments in services. And I think quite a lot of those developments in the service space and in the social media, for example, have often been articulated through the medium of the English language, which again has been a disadvantage for some Japanese. So I think that partly explains why Japan doesn't seem quite as at the forefront and leading as it certainly appeared in the 70s and 80s when I was first going there. But I think I wouldn't underestimate the amount of important research that goes on in Japan. I mean, Japan has a very successful record in Nobel Prize winners. It's got some distinguished universities. Quite a lot of the important research in Japan is done within some of the biggest companies, and that's still really important. Often those companies might end up making the investments to bring that into manufacturing in other parts of the world where there's higher growth, and domestically, because of the demographic reasons that I was describing and Japan's shrinking population, a lot of Japanese companies are shifting more of their investments to overseas markets that are growing faster. And I think the other factor, of course, is that we just see many more competitors who are also now part of the scene than was the case in the 70s and 80s. And of course, none greater than China, which has become a huge dominant force in the world economy, but also countries like India, particularly in the IT field, are doing a lot of things that back in the 70s and 80s you wouldn't have seen happening. So I think it's a more crowded space, but I think Japan still has got a lot of strengths.
Olivia, do we have any questions online? None at the moment, okay. I'm looking around to see if we have any hands up in the room. We do. There's Tim.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Paul. It's a really fantastic lecture. I was just wondering, from a diplomat's point of view, as a British ambassador, how do you think Britain is currently viewed in Japan, and how it might have changed over the last kind of 5 years, while it's been quite an interesting period in our own recent history? So just your opinion on the British, how it's viewed in Japan, I'd really like to hear about. Thank you.
So when I returned to Japan in 2017 as ambassador, Brexit was obviously underway. And I remember one of the first people I called on in Japan, a senior official, said, "We know Britain, you always plan these things. You've obviously got a cunning plan about how Brexit's going to work." Well, obviously no one had shared that plan with me either, but there was a period when I think the Japanese were confused, first of all, by the outcome of the referendum. But then I think they became used to that, and they understood that it's up to countries to make their own democratic choices. But I think the thing that was a bigger shock to them was actually the disarray that then happened within the British political system, when a succession of prime ministers found it difficult to get their legislation through on Brexit. And I think it didn't conform to the prior images of the UK that Japanese had of a country with long traditions of sound governments and organized political processes. I think it was quite a confusing period, and it wasn't immaterial to Japan, because Japan has massive investments in the UK. About 40% of Japan's investments in Europe are all in the UK. For many of the big manufacturers, they are locked into big European supply chains, and they have big markets in Europe. So they were worried about what the economic consequences of Brexit would be. But I think as we moved through and we ended up getting future arrangements, they might not have been exactly the arrangements the Japanese would have liked, but there were arrangements that they could work with. We didn't see any very significant shift of Japanese investment away from the UK. There were some things that had to move for regulatory reasons in financial services or pharmaceuticals, but it was a relatively small portion of the whole. I'm not saying that we can sit on our laurels. This is something that we'll have to continue to be vigilant and competitive on. But I think now at this stage, the Japanese have come to terms with that more economically, and they still respect many aspects of the UK economically, like the strengths of the City of London, the strengths of the great universities and the R&D that gets carried out in them. But alongside all of the things that were happening in the economy and Brexit, on the other side of the coin is the security and political piece, where I think Japan saw the UK as a very dependable partner who was actually becoming even more engaged in the security of the region. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One was that post-Brexit, the UK was looking for new alliances and new opportunities in the world. And the second reason was that we were coming off the back of the decade or so of war fighting in the Middle East, which had followed 9/11. So Britain actually had more capacity to do things like send its aircraft carrier to the Pacific region. And so I think Japan saw many positives in the things that the UK was doing in the political and security sphere, which to some extent were balancing some of the negatives that at that stage, in the early stages of Brexit, they were picking up on the economic side. So I think Japan sees the UK as a very significant partner who they want to see themselves working even more closely with. And this was something that the late Prime Minister Abe attached a lot of importance to. He developed very strong personal relationships with all the British Prime Ministers during my time in office. Thank you.
Returning to this fine volume that I've had the privilege to read through myself, and I'm sure you've all read your most recent issue of the Center for Japanese Studies e-newsletter that was sent out just yesterday, I think, which has an interview with Paul about the book. One of the things that really struck me was that this is quite an achievement. You got to see all 47 prefectures while you were in Japan. I thought one of the aspects of the book that I particularly enjoyed when you returned to some of your favorite places amongst those 47 prefectures was that you had a section which was, of course, Twitter encourages, of comments from your 30,000 odd followers, I think. What were some of the most surprising and interesting comments that you think you got out of the 39 places that you chose?
Well, I think the most surprising was how many Japanese just seemed surprised that a foreigner would love different aspects of their country. They kept writing messages just saying, thank you so much for liking our country, which, you know, if you've visited Japan, and you know it's got many great things that are fun to do and see and fascinating. So it's not at all hard to find things to like about it. I think some of the more interesting comments I received, well, I mentioned a couple. One was I described going to Japanese castles. I don't know if you had the chance to visit Japanese castles, but because they're built of wood, the first thing they do is make you take your shoes off. You have to put them in a plastic bag, which you have to carry with you as you go around. And then they have multiple stories, floors in the Japanese castles. So you have to climb up these very steep wooden ladders in slippery socks with your bag of shoes swinging about. And it can sometimes make you feel a little bit vulnerable. And so I described this, and I got so many interesting comments on it. People saying, yes, I find that too. It's really scary when I go up the ladder. And someone said, oh, you know, the trouble with these castles is they're designed for military purposes, not for habitation. And the best thing was someone sent me a link to Rakuten, which is the sort of Japanese online marketplace like Amazon. They actually sent me a link to a pair of deodorized socks with rubber soles for grip. And they said, perhaps these will be useful for when you climb up the ladder. The other quite fun one was I did one about eating with chopsticks. And I said, you know, it's a bit irritating sometimes after living in Asia for probably 30 years to have people say with surprise, oh, I see you can use chopsticks. And I got some really interesting reactions to that, which sort of fell into two categories. The first ones were sort of apologetic, and they wrote, oh, I'm really sorry, Ambassador, that my fellow countrymen are so rude as to question your dexterity with the chopsticks. And then the other group decided they'd better go out of their way to praise my chopstick skills. And they would say, we can see from the photograph that the ambassador has incredible finger skills with his chopsticks. So there were lots of interesting comments, which some of which I fed back in the book.
Well, I can't believe that the foreign and the diplomatic office would dream of sending ambassadors to Japan without the suitable chopstick using skills. So it's great to know that was being recognized. Olivia, I think unless there are any burning, we have time for one question online in that case.
Thank you. Yes, we have one question from online, which says, I had the opportunity to speak to Tim Hitchens when he was ambassador. He was intrigued by the Japanese obsession with Downton Abbey. In your time there, which British cultural products went down best in Japanese society?
So I think actually probably the thing that most caught people's attention during my time there was rugby, because Japan was hosting the Rugby World Cup in 2019. And it was a great privilege to be there as a British ambassador at the time, because I had 4 teams to support. I had to support England and Scotland and Wales, and also Ireland, because it was an all of Ireland team. involving the Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And the Japanese people really got into this weird sport with a strange shaped ball and strange shaped foreigners in some cases too. And the Japanese team actually played really well. They were a great representative for their country. But the Japanese host community were incredible. Every town, I think there are about 10 or 11 cities across the whole length of Japan that hosted events. They were absolutely packed with signs welcoming the foreign teams. When the Welsh team practiced they were down in Kitakyushu, the southernmost island, for their training camp. And I think 10,000 local Japanese turned up to watch a training session and sang the Welsh national anthem in katakana. And actually it was quite useful to me because at the matches I was supposed to sing the Welsh national anthem. And I don't know about you, but I really quite struggle with reading the Welsh. Even when I've got it in phonetic Western characters, I struggled with it. But the Japanese had a version in katakana, which is their phonetic pronunciation. And with that in front of me, I sang the Welsh national anthem with no problems at all. So I think the Japanese people really welcomed rugby and everything that went around that into their hearts during my time there.
Well, I think we have a new topic there for a PhD in translation studies, maybe. So thank you very much indeed, Paul. Thanks once again for a wonderful talk. And I think I'd like to invite everybody just to join me in a round of applause once again. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay.
Just before we invite you to join us to some maybe mercifully chopstick-free mince pies and some sake in the foyer just outside, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us here in the hall today, and in particular all of our friends and colleagues who have been able to join us online. We'll be hopefully posting, I believe, the lecture on our YouTube channel at some point in the near future. Those of you online may well receive, in fact, I think everybody may well receive a link to a feedback form in a follow-up mail, and this will probably come out tomorrow, Olivia, I believe. We'll be always very grateful for those of you who fill in those forms and let us have that feedback. It's very valuable for us in terms of thinking about our future programs, obviously our wonderful supporters like to know what our audiences are thinking about what we're doing as well. I can't believe we're already at the end of another year. So we start the year of the rabbit with on the 19th of January with Dr. Joshua Friedman, Associate Professor of Japanese at the University of Oklahoma, who's recently penned The Japanese Myths, A Guide to Gods, Heroes and Spirits. And the booking link for the talk, Reflections on the Southern Goddess, the Evolution of a Japanese Myth Over Time, is now live on our website. And we'll be announcing full details in our monthly e-bulletin that will come out early in the new year. So all it remains for me to do is to wish you all a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and to thank our wonderful speaker once again for that talk. Not only speaking to you now, but in fact, Paul very kindly came up earlier this afternoon and met with some of our students who were very intrigued and very interested to find out what life as an ambassador was really all about. So thank you for that, as well as for this evening's wonderful lecture. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. And good evening.
Okay.